Let's now move the conversation from just Kenya and pivot
West.
to the continent. And we've seen what's happening in the continent. There are a number of elections that are coming up. Even if we just don't talk about the upcoming parliamentary elections in Kenya, we talk about now the presidential elections in the region. There's one coming up in Tanzania. We have seen some form of change of government in Mali. We have seen, there are countries that are preparing for elections. We've seen demand for finally the exit of a long-serving leader of Cameroon and others, right? So what is this? I mean, there's various ways in which people are trying to effect change of leadership.
Well, I mean, if you want to look at what has happened in Cote d'Ivoire over the last 10 years, a coup was instituted and got one leader out and brought another one in. There have been cries saying that, even if this coup was instituted, it didn't mean then that the leader we got after that was the solution. Same thing happened in Egypt when there were calls for, ousting of the president. And then there were cries afterwards saying that, maybe the option that we got was not the better one. We've seen that in Mali now with the institution of an interim government after the coup that happened a few weeks ago. But who has taken over? The cries are that we hope what we will get coming in is that there will be new leadership. 37 years of a leader in Cameroon, we now hear more vicious calls for the ousting of Biya and saying that it is time that he actually left. So is this quote-unquote by force removal of governments in different parts of the country the way to then bring in governments or leaders that, countries will think will work? Again, it seems like it is the year of presidential elections on the continent. Uganda, Tanzania, Ghana is upcoming, Cote d'Ivoire waiting, Mali also in the waiting. In another 2 years, Kenya will join there. Malawi just finished, Burundi just finished. It seems like the year. Is this new quote-unquote dispensation the way to bring in new forms of leadership? And as we look at what's going on now, how then will it change the political footprint on the continent? I think is the question that a lot of us are asking now. And are we raising the profile then when it comes to good governance on the continent?
Sounds like what you're describing would be different from what has happened before, is it?
Would it?
Is there any difference? Well, there is a difference in terms of like in the 70s and maybe early 80s, there were coups. And now it's the people who are participating in the democratic removal of or change of governments when they feel that there's need to change government. But in the case of like Mali and maybe what you're saying in Cameroon, where people are up in arms and they're feeling you've been in office for too long and we demand that you step down.
Yeah, look at what happened in the 70s and the 80s, like what you're talking about with coups that happened in different countries. The military was directly involved. Look at what happened in Mali and Cote d'Ivoire and what's happening in Cameroon today, whereby the military was involved in the coup that took place in Mali. You had the people, you had Malians in the streets applauding what the military had done because they were in direct agreement with this. They were involved in the process with their voice. Whereas 30, 40 years ago, you would never see something like that. A coup is happening, people are hiding in their homes. And now people are in the streets saying, yes, we condone this. We say this is the way in which it must happen.
We support whatever is happening.
For sure.
Let's bring in somebody to help us digest this matter. And this is a political commentator with the Africa Report, Patrick Kwabena Imani. Good morning, Patrick.
Hi, good morning, guys. How are you doing?
Good morning.
Very well, thank you. How are you? In which part of Africa are you this morning? You're an African trotter.
Well, I'm speaking to you today from Accra, Ghana. So pretty much on the western side of the continent at the moment.
Right. You've heard our introduction to the topic, changes in government, and asking ourselves, are these changes where the people are actually rising and demanding a better change? Is this a new way of bringing better leadership to Africa?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think you both lay the foundations, quite apt. Is this the way Africa wants to be changing its leadership? I'm not entirely sure, because again, even if you look outside of politics, we've had our own traditional systems of governance that we have run for years. And I don't think that, we were changing leadership by the barrel of the gun, so to speak. So this, I wouldn't say, is something that Africans are looking for. I think it is the existential crisis that you have on the continent as far as political leadership is concerned is what is calling for this. And I always summarize this, to mean the sort of extractive political institutions that we have had, post-independent Africa, which are not inclusive, is what citizens are beginning to find ways, by which they can remove them. And in areas or in countries where the government or the leaders are very autocratic and for a very long time have had a grip on the military as an establishment to practically, crack down any sort of dissent, you find citizens uproar almost toppling both sides, of that sort of a system. Where the military is a little bit balanced, in terms of its engagement within the activities of the state, you find in these cases that the citizens will sort of throw their weight behind any of the military leaders that seeks to topple a long-standing government. So it's not to suggest that Africans generally, or this is beginning to look like a trend. Of course, if that were the case, then any government that is elected in Africa, today that runs, or stays in office for 4 years, citizens shouldn't be interested in going to the ballot.
Right.
They might as well just, hit the streets and then decide that, that government has got to go. I don't think that's really the case. It is really a case of the long-standing dictators on the continent who have extracted the political institutions just for themselves and have not, included the citizens in decision making.
Are you saying, am I to understand that you're saying that it's the leadership style of many of our leaders on this continent that actually bring in these military rulerships that we've seen? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, yes and no, because when you again talk about the leadership, the military is equally part of that sort of a leadership system of governance. I think the point I'm trying to make is that the clarion call by some of the countries which you outlined, clearly, the clarion call by citizens in these countries to get some of these leaders removed is as a function of these leaders having been in office for decades without creating an inclusive system by which citizens can actively participate in development and in policy making and ensuring that, their needs are equally met. And any country, any society that is constructed this way, built along these lines, more often than not is going to come to topple. I mean, even if you look in our own history, like I was telling you before, where you didn't have the sort of defined Western defined democratic systems of governance, when you had a king who typically, didn't do things that inure to the benefit of the citizens, at a point, this king could get destituted, right, or removed from the skin. And so it's just a natural human phenomenon that when you're a leader, you must make a conscious effort to build inclusive institutions by which the people you're governing take part in decision-making. If you don't do that, and you have somebody like Paul Biya, you had somebody who, for nearly 40 years, may so rest in peace, Robert Mugabe, for example, for decades, and a portion of the country feels neglected. In my opinion, when you have a very youthful population falling in that bracket, it is a waiting time bomb, and that is what may lead to people preferring this. So I suspect a part of the leadership style will be called to bear, but the leadership style itself has got to be defined by the institutions of governance, so that these institutions, if they are inclusive in decision making, of course, then you're looking to a system that people will be excited about. If not, they will definitely call for a change.
Look across Africa, and let's look at leaderships that don't have the military at the head of it. Even when there has been change and there's been civilian rule, tell me how many of these countries have actually experienced change, except, of course, for the change of the leader. Change that is positive and which resonates with the sort of governance that you're speaking of.
Well, so again, so you may have a lot of countries on the continent today that mimic what you have just described, which is that the changes in the sort of the political system. So yeah, you don't have the interference of the military, but you have the same political institutions, so to speak, or political parties that may run the affairs of government one way or the other. The point is that for a lot of the countries, we have created these bubbles or cocoons. that are non-transparent and non-inclusive. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. So if you take a typical case like Ghana, for instance, which has been, at least in the last 30 years, been described as one of the most stable democracies across the continent, there's a major difficulty here. The difficulty is that a lot of decisions that are made are decisions that are sitting in Parliament, limited consultation to citizens. So you have a system that just a few political elites sort of manage that system here and there, and there are changes every 4 years or 5 years. That system in itself is not inclusive. For a system like that, it's just a matter of time before citizens take the law in their hands. And you saw a typical example of that in the case of al-Bashir and others you've seen on the continent, where the citizens and professionals decided that, look, we've had enough. The military is sitting aside. The military gets involved and tries to create some bit of stability. But even then, the power vacuum that is left is always a problem. So I suspect the struggle is really about the spoils of political power for decision making. So it doesn't really matter whether it's the military that is running it or it is the civilians that are running it. To the extent that that system excludes majority of the people in terms of decision making and inclusivity and development, citizens will always rise up against the system.
Patrick, even as you talk about this and saying whether it would be military that will get involved or civilians that will get involved, we find that, interestingly, across the continent, whichever way you want to look at it, civilians in their headspace, unfortunately, are more involved with their personal development. And when I say that, I don't mean making yourself better. I mean surviving on a daily basis. Unfortunately, the majority of citizens on the continent are dealing with survival. It could be as a result of this deficit in leadership that you talk about, or deficit in good governance. Do you really see a situation whereby the political fatigue on the part of civilians will get to the point whereby, beyond being in support of things like the overthrow of government, that they would actually be actively involved in the pursuit for this good governance?
That's a very important question you ask. So essentially, I suspect what will happen, and you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of the young people we have on the continent of Africa today, I mean, you wake up in the morning and the first thing you're thinking about, is bread and butter, how to keep soul together. And that has been as a result of the failure of leadership to ensuring that they create the right enabling environment for people to survive. And these are the conversations that we're having today on the continent of Africa. And a lot of young people, in my opinion, are gradually getting involved in the conversation. They are recognizing that the trade-offs for not actively finding the right systems by which you are governed and understanding and participating, those trade-offs are dire, okay? So a lot of young people across the continent today, you have a lot of youthful movements, a lot of youthful engagements in various aspects, of governance across the continent today, and it's just a matter of time. If I permit me to give you a few examples. I mean, we saw cases in Nigeria, for example, where for a very long time, young people were not actively involved in politics. Even those who were, you had these barriers, from a regulatory point of view that effectively prevented them from, either contesting for, leadership positions, either, the office of the presidency itself or senatorial and representative positions.
Yeah.
What did young people do? Young people across the 180 or 200 million population of Nigeria decided that we've had enough, right? So they actively got involved, pushed the system for the system to change, and acknowledge that young people have to actually get involved today. So it's not happening at the pace that we wanted, but the reality is that it's happening. Another example is what you saw on the northern part of Africa, where for years, young people were not actively participating or were not benefiting from the largesse of public policy. What happened? You saw Ben Ali go away. You saw Hosni Mubarak equally go away because millions and millions of young people got onto the streets and said they were tired. So I guess it is understanding the wheels of governance, which is one of the things I've been talking about in recent times when I've had the opportunity of having conversations like this. If young people want to get involved, the question is, what will you do? Because it's a system that is non-inclusive. You don't want a few young people who equally get involved, sit at the table, and don't recognize that the systems have to be inclusive and participatory enough. And so I think that sort of re-engineering is what must happen. And a lot of that is happening today, with the advent of technology, social media. All of these dynamics are beginning to change the conversation. And I suspect if we go down this route, we will be able to work a solution that may work. You may not have one that, why it becomes a one-size-fits-all, but you may have countries that tend to show examples of how these things have to be done.
Right.
You talked about, what's happening in various countries. I'm looking at the case of Ivory Coast, where now we have an election coming up. We have the case of whether the current president should vie again. He says he will not. Then he says he will because, his chosen successor, his party's chosen successor, better say that, unfortunately dies suddenly. And then we're also seeing now former presidents coming up. Is there any change to the system? Or is this just a system that's being perpetuated by the same ruling elite that, we have had a musical chairs, so-and-so left, so-and-so has come in, and now the past so-and-so wants to come back in. So is there a change in system there, or is it just the same ruling elite running and managing the same system that they've had for a long time?
I'm afraid my response to that will be that, the system really hasn't changed. And the reason the system hasn't changed is because the people who are the helm of affairs themselves don't have personal values that align with some of the things I've talked about, period. If I take somebody like Alassane Ouattara, who for a very long time worked with the International Monetary Fund, he has a significant exposure globally. He understands what these systems of governance mean. I am scandalized as a young person and a keen observer of the democratic credentials of somebody like that, given the kind of dispensation that the country finds itself. It's almost unheard of that somebody, typically will ascribe that behavior to, the people who typically came through the military juntas, later transition and tried to become democratic in themselves. Our own former president, Rawlings in Ghana, is a typical example. Robert Mugabe is an example. You have the Egyptian president, Al-Sisi being an example. Those are the people we ascribe this sort of behavior to, not those who have had the opportunity of experiencing what real inclusive development means. And so for Alassane Ouattara to sort of suggest that, because the political party has put him forward, right, he will go ahead. I think it's not only a dent on him as a person, but I think that it goes back to confirm, the second suggestion you make, which is that in some of these countries, it's almost the same people are playing chess. The systems are not really changing. And so I think that for a country like Cote d'Ivoire, ECOWAS has got a significant responsibility in there. Dialogue really must happen before this gets into a full-blown chaotic narrative that we are not expecting.
But then wouldn't you argue that the people themselves are okay with it? If you just imagine about Ivory Coast, they've come out of a civil war because of demand for change of leadership. And that here we are. Yes, there's agitation for change of leadership, but they are considering the same candidates. So is it that the people themselves are okay and comfortable with the system as it is?
I don't think the people of Ivory Coast are okay with Alassane Ouattara and the very old, the old guards of politics being at the helm of affairs. If anything, it is the opposite. That is the case. The challenge has always been the extent to which the current system itself is open for different faces and new personalities to actively get involved. And I think that the case of Ivory Coast is not so different from a lot of the Francophone countries you have where, and I say this, carefully, right, where you have countries like metropolitan France who still somewhat, are still able to pull proper strings, right, all the way from Europe in determining who effectively becomes the leader of these countries. We know this. We know it's happening across the Francophone region. And so I wouldn't say that the people of Ivory Coast are comfortable with leaders, running terms, going 3-4 terms. I don't think they're comfortable with that. There's no young person in Africa today that prefers 60 or 70-year-olds to keep staying in office for more than 15, 20 years. Nobody does that. At the end of the day, I think the most important thing that young people in Ivory Coast, some of who have had the opportunity of working in different areas of civic advocacy with, the things that are passionate and things that concern them are, everyday bread and butter issues and the ability to take part in decision making. And so it's important we put that in context.
Can I ask, do you really think that what we call our traditional African values have any impact in, one, the acceptance of some of these leadership styles that we see, or the tolerance we have towards it, and the perpetuation of it? Let me explain why I'm asking. Do you really think if a young person was in power that they would do something different from what we see from these older leaders? It's in that context that I'm asking the question.
But the reality is that it may not necessarily be the case. I mean, again, I go back to the way the systems have been designed. If you have a parliament today, and I'm going to use Ghana as a case study, if you have a parliament today that makes decisions, majority of which are never public, these documents and decisions, that the contracts and things they will sign on behalf of the citizens are never made public. People don't know how some of these decisions are arrived at. If you put all the smartest people in the country in that sort of a narrative, there's no way the system is going to change. Same way, if you put a lot of young people and remove the old persons, it's not going to change. So I suspect the point I'm getting to in all the submissions I've been making is that we need inclusive systems of governance. We need inclusive systems of decision-making and development. If we are not doing that, it really doesn't matter who is in there. The point about young people is that the pace at which the world is changing today, young people have a better appreciation of what the world is going to look like tomorrow. The most innovative businesses, the most innovative enterprises that are being built today, some of which are coming off of social media and all these platforms, they understand it better. Young people are working seamlessly across different value chains, different spheres of life. Even if you look at COVID-19 as we are confronted with it today, how many 70-year-olds or 60-year-olds do you find on the front line? How many? You have a lot of young people who are either working in healthcare, education, and are actively involved. So the point is that these are energies that if you put at the helm of affairs, there is a tendency that they will deliver value because they have an interest in what the country will look like tomorrow. It's not to suggest that we should take that without recognizing the need to build the same inclusive system inclusive system of policy implementation and inclusive system of governance that I've been talking about. No, we need these. And I think that in engagements that I've been involved in, some of which are Pan-African, what you find is that young people identify with these objectives. They understand and they connect with them. They understand the need to, for example, take social media as a tool to mobilize citizens for action. They understand that. Having a 70-year-old gets that phenomenon that I can build a participatory planning tool that can reach, 300 million people at the goal for me to get an insight into what they need to do. Not many of them get that. And so I'm saying young people are in a better position to run these affairs. Even if you look at our private sector today, not many 70-year-olds are there. Not many. And that's where we are generating value for supporting the economic development of the continent today. How are 40 and 35-year-olds doing better in terms of leadership in the private sector? And for some strange reason, we say they can't do better in the public sector. They can.
Patrick,
they just
I think
have not been given the opportunity to.
We ought also to brand you the greatest ambassador and advocate for youth leadership as well. Youth involvement in governance. Patrick Kwabena Imani is a political commentator, writes with the Africa Report. This morning we're looking at changes in government and systems of government across the continent and what's happening politically across the continent. Joining us this morning from Accra, Ghana, is Patrick Kwabena. He is a political commentator, writes with the Africa Report. We are talking about politics in Africa. I see you wanted to ask a question before we went to the break.
Yes, I was thinking of one of the most youthful leaders we've ever had on this continent, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Sankara. And, his leadership was cut short by an assassination, and the leader who took over from him was a leader until 2014. Now, would you say that Thomas Sankara perhaps gives us an example of what his leadership style might be considered to be, should we say, a good example of what leaders should be on the continent?
I mean, I should say that, and I think it's a very important question you also ask, but I should say that, I'm one of those who sees, Sankara as one of those leaders who we really would not be able to tell what he would have looked like, given that, he had to be assassinated. He was assassinated in office. However, the little things he did when he became a leader for Burkina Faso gives you a certain indication, okay, of what he could have become. I mean, one of the most, I wouldn't want to call him feminist, but one of the foremost leaders in a time who recognized, for example, the relevance of women in development was Thomas Sankara. I mean, I can't even compare him and his ideals and the thoughts he had even to the likes of Nkrumah in that area. And Kwame Nkrumah we herald as one of the foremost thinkers in terms of leadership on the African continent today, and the ideals he had and what he thought could have been done, for the African to take his rightful place within the global sphere of things. And so Sankara being truncated we really cannot tell. But I can speak authoritatively and suggest that what he did in that short time of leading the country of Ivory Coast and his partnership and collaboration with other leaders across the francophone world, but also cross-carpeting into the anglophone region in West Africa, for instance, I thought was very profound. And it is for that reason that up until today, there's a huge debate even in Burkina Faso about what the country would have looked like if Blaise Compaoré and his team had not ousted him. And so I think there are some lessons to be learned there. We shouldn't just celebrate the individual and think of the individual as somebody who would have done better. But what are those ideals he stood for, and how do we create systems today and get people to understand what these ideals have to look like and get a lot more young people excited about this? And bear in mind, some of these brilliant leaders became who they became, and we know them for, not when they were 70 years old. Sankara must have been 27 or 29 years old when he was doing the things I'm talking about. And so I find it strange that somehow today you have to be 70 years, must have cronies around you to be able to make sense of what the countries that they're running must look like.
I'm thinking of one of your former presidents, Jerry Rawlings. He also came to power at a very, very young age. Now, he is still alive, so at least we have a point of comparison.
Right.
Is it politically
correct?
Is it politically correct for you to perhaps bring in the discussion of comparison?
Of course. I mean, we're talking leadership from the African continent. And I should say, that, former President Rawlings, His Excellency, I should say, he's a very divisive figure. I should say carefully, even within Ghanaian politics. As far as the Ghana as a country is concerned, I think he's the longest-serving president we've had. He ran the country for almost 19 years. The only person to have successfully organized, 2 coups d'etats, and one coup d'etat that was not successful, which he was penalized for. But I think Rawlings is somewhat a divisive figure, and I submit that he came into the country at a time where some argue, and some scholars that have studied him would argue, that the country needed somebody with that level of energy and recognition that the systems by which we were being governed were corrupt. Okay? There's a huge debate about whether the mechanisms he deployed in cleansing the system, so to speak, were adequate. And the political party he built and the sort of leadership style he led up until 1999 when, he had to leave office in the year 2000, whether those ideals he stood for as a person are ideals that transmitted beyond him to people that he effectively worked with. And I think that's a major conversation point. What you cannot take away from him, however, is that while his peers, the likes of Mugabe that came to power through, the barrel of the gun, and a few others that you find, we have Eduardo dos Santos, who for years was in Angola, we don't know what he did. Jerry managed to cede power to a political party that he had personal differences with for more than 20 years. That is very difficult for any of the African leaders that came to power with the barrel of the gun, to do. It's very difficult. So even in the year 2000, we were not sure what the country was going to look like. And I think that within that context, sometimes some people like to credit him for it. He pushed the youthful energies of university graduates into areas of the economy that typically weren't happening before. He moved a lot of graduates into agriculture, into construction. He had to use the military to get them done. I think maybe those that feel that he's one of those that leads a certain light, as far as the democracy of Ghana as a country and his contribution to African politics is concerned, maybe see him in a certain light. And maybe we look at Sankara within that light, they may have some similarities. What for me would be a stark difference would be the sort of leadership styles that they both would have deployed. I think Sankara was a bit more inclusive. He recognized, marginalized groups in society that have to be catered for, even though he was coming from a military background. You don't see a lot of that in the ideals of Rawlings as a person. However, in his very final term before he left office between 1996 and 2000, you got a lot of that, and that was because the country itself was now grinding gradually the democratic wheels properly. A lot of things were being done at the time, even though there was a lot of concentration of power at the center. So you had all these things that somewhat take away from the credentials. But in terms of similarities, I think both of them really came in at a time where their countries needed this. And I always say that if you look across Africa, post-independent Africa, the countries you have had leaders or governments that were instituted by colonial powers. And the colonial systems by which we were governed were not inclusive. No colonial, I mean, the Brits didn't come and build an inclusive system of governance for Ghana as a country. No. In fact, they tried to use our traditional institutions, i.e. chiefs and community leaders, to build parallel systems that excluded citizens completely. If you superimpose on this any government after colonialism without re-engineering that system of governance, you have a problem. You only replace the white man with a black man, and so you still have a tyranny of minority which suppresses the majority. And that is what a lot of the African countries went through. And over time, that non-inclusivity will then mean that people will rise up, the military will rise up, overthrow one government, and all the countries have that checkered history. Okay, so Rawlings, yes, very fine gentleman as far as politics is concerned, but like I've said, he still remains a divisive figure, and there are a lot of people that still look up to him in terms of leadership and what he did in his time.
A lot of governments in this day and age are having this conversation about inclusivity, Patrick, and, saying that the system, essentially, quote unquote, of government needs to change, whereby some of these groups you're talking about then must be included. Unfortunately, the inclusivity they speak of is come along with me and let's do this together, as opposed to come and also share what attributes of leadership you can and eventually sit in these positions, unless it's forced, like the examples that you gave in Nigeria. And of the examples that you see in Northern Africa. Here right now, conversations in Kenya are around inclusivity in government and, amendments of constitutions to bring this in. Do you feel, when you talk about people the likes of Nkrumah and people the likes of Sankara, that there are youth on the continent today with a robust enough idea to get into government, as opposed to, taking up what people would call, quote unquote, the smaller positions, but to the highest level, and being bold enough to say that I am ready to come in and see how I can contribute towards the changing of the system?
Well, there are a number of young people that have had the opportunity of engaging, and again, I say this, reservedly, because the political system at the time, of the likes of, Nyerere, Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, Secretary, etc., the time is different from today. Today, you have systems that I describe as semblances of democracy. In fact, there's a book written by Obasanjo and a few others called Democracy Works. And what they do in that book, General Obasanjo himself, who I suspect you are familiar with his work as former president of Nigeria, himself coming from the military, military regime, chronicles the experiences of various countries on the African continent, very high-powered panel that did this work, trying to understand how democracy has evolved over time. And that evolution has equally defined the kind of leaders that we have on the continent of Africa today. I will argue, if you pick Kwame Nkrumah from the 1940s and put him today in any of the countries of Africa, he will struggle. The reason he will struggle is because the tectonic plates are no longer aligned for that sort of orientation. So the young people you are having now are trying to understand the systems by which they are governed and find innovative ways around it by which they participate. If I give a practical example, there's a young man in Nigeria called Hamzat Lawal, who has, in my opinion, revolutionized what accountability in governance will look like. What the EFCC in Nigeria is told to do, he's managed to amass significant amount of young people, and that work has been exported into countries like, Gambia, where he has different young people working in there. There's considerations of doing that in Ghana. And I think that kind of thinking, he's young. Hamzat is now 40 years old, all right? But that thinking is almost changing what public financial management in Nigeria is going to look like. If in 2023 I am told that he's made EFCC post, I'm not going to be surprised, because he has what it takes to get that done. And again, you are talking about a country that has equally gone through the mill of reducing the barriers, for young people to actually participate in politics. I suspect, what you're asking is, should two young people just be excited about going to sit in an office with the current system and just be fine by that, or they're really thinking about how they can almost overturn the system like the forebearers saw systems that they needed to overturn. I think that the plates we are dealing with now are a bit different. The systems of governance are a bit entrenched. The levels of corruption we have today are unimaginable. You have collaborations between Western companies, Western entities, the vested interests and businesses in politics are just unbelievable. So that you have to be crafty as a young person to be able to actively engage the system. I equally work in some circles as a civic advocate, right? And as a policy analyst, going after big, high-level policy conversations, and sometimes you walk into a room and you feel that, well, the job that has been done there, you really have done what, can be done to get things working. But it really doesn't happen. So I guess the point I'm making in summary is that there are young people who see it, but the conditions now are different from the conditions 50 years ago. So they're finding different tools and different systems by which they engage the system. And that is working for them, albeit being slow.
When you talk about young people and governance in Africa, young people are the majority in every country you go to in the continent. And then we are talking about them being led by this minority who is the bit older people, but the older people who have experience, hands-on experience in governance, and they understand the governance. I put it to you that maybe the young people are not just sitting back. It's working with the system as it is. It is knowing that these are the people who understand government, so you continue electing them, but also you're electing very many other young people in other cadres of political office. I'm sure if you went to any country, you'll find that in the civic wards, the people who are being elected are younger people. In this country itself, if you go across the civic wards around the country, about over 80% are people who are below 35 years, 35 and below. So the young people are already participating in elective politics. Young people are already participating in putting people into positions of authority, whether it's in legislative or policy positions. But then, it's just happening. Maybe it's just happening organically, that this is how the current young leaders are the ones who are going to be the older people when the younger people come into other parts of other position of government. So it's not like the young people are really sitting back, or they are not aware, or they are not participating, or they are not involved. They are.
Now, here's my one bullet response to that. Why would there be a law that says if you're not 40 years old, you can't run for president? Why? Why is that the case? Why should that be the case? If the assumption is that, well, young people are seeing that, well, yeah, the old people are more experienced, let them do what they're doing when we equally get there. We're still perpetrating the mindset that for some reason, for you to effectively become a public official in politics, where you make decisions that matter, you have to be 70 or 60 years old. And I think that argument has got to be thrown out of the window. Okay? Otherwise, the what you have just surmised will suggest that there has to be this pipeline where the people that equally understand that, and I'm not downplaying experience here. Experience is incredibly important. But you see, James Buchanan makes us understand in public choice theory that if the person is going to make a decision and the decision does not impact him as it would the broader population in equal measure, close your mind. There's no way he's going to make a decision that's in the interest of the broader population. And so consistently, you must build systems where the people that are making decisions have incentives that are aligned to it. It's one reason that some of us have difficulties when, we hear, politicians, whether young or old in certain countries, are given this preferential treatment and they live in bubbles, and so they have practically have no appreciation whatsoever of what the difficulties of broader population really is. It's the same thing with the caliber and characteristics of leaders that we have. I'm not saying 70-year-old is necessarily bad. The experience is good. But if I have a 40-year-old CEO who's running a multi-billion-dollar business here on the African continent, and for some reason I am told he does not have experience in governance, and so he cannot, by virtue of being 40 years old, run for the presidency of the country, that makes no sense. Because in my opinion, the public sector decision is actually much more important. And so why we leave it to people who, in my opinion, yes, they may have experience, but public choice theory is against them, and more often than not, they're incapacitated, and a lot of them. I think that's what the problem is. So don't have a country that is represented, in terms of the structure of population. In some cases, you have 60% being below 35 years old. and somehow the profile of leadership and decision making, you have an average age of 65 or 70. That mismatch creates a major problem for decision making. And I think that's what has got to be addressed. So for some of the countries and areas you talk about, yes, you have a lot of young people that may get involved in decision making. They'll go and elect young people at the local council level, so people will learn and get experience as they climb the ladder. That's an observation that exists. But we cannot have structural barriers that prevent young people who have the capabilities to do the big stuff from doing it. And that's the example you see in a lot of the countries. Away from that, I think another notion equally must be dispelled. And that thinking that the decision, or what I've been talking about in terms of participatory governance, really is about electing public officials. In my opinion, the vote is pretty useless in democracy. I know people will disagree, and I've shared this view on a lot of platforms, and very well-learned professors disagree. That is a view I hold passionately. Here's why I say that. My responsibility as a citizen is not when I vote. My responsibility as a citizen is my paying taxes to the state and the state's ability to deliver on public goods and services, period.
It ends there.
Question is, how inclusive is that system so that if I am a citizen and the government levels what you call a value-added tax, VAT, on all goods and services in the country and increases it to 20%, what it effectively means is that I am paying as a citizen, whether I am 5 years old, 2 years old, 18 years old, when I buy the product, I pay that tax. For some strange reason, when it comes to the utilization of that tax, I am not included in that decision making.
Right.
That's my point about participative development, period. And if we don't build systems that says my grandmother in the village can, by the mobile phone, suggest what project in her mind has got to be deployed, or my 18-year-old brother who is in a senior high school can be asked what he thinks or feels about the education he's receiving and what he thinks the alternative could be if there's a way of improving it. If you're not taking that feedback to inform decision making, I'm sorry you don't have an inclusive system of governance. So whether that young 18 or 20-year-old goes to vote for another young person or not, the point is that we are not getting anywhere. We have reduced democracy to the vote. And that is why that is the only thing that is of interest to the 70-year-olds on the continent today. It is only then that they find that young people are important. So when it's time for elections, I suspect this happens in Kenya. They'll share bags of rice for young people. They walk around. That's when they start speaking the language of young people. But when it comes to how we use that tax money to drive development, you say young people are not involved. I know a lot of millennials who wouldn't want to even vote. But if you ask them, and I did a poll for about 2,000 different young people in this country, the question was very simple, and I'll throw it to the three of you in the studio. If you have the chance, right, if you have the chance to elect with the vote, to pick a leader to drive development, or you are given a scale of preferences of items in your community that you have to select based on your knowledge of revenue in the community, which would you prefer? Would you prefer to elect a leader or use your thumb to select the project? Which would you prefer?
Select the project.
Select the project.
For sure.
Period. But none of your government gives you the opportunity to select the project.
do that. Nowhere.
You would choose that rather than picking the people to run it. And that is the thinking for a lot of young people on the African continent today. And that's where inclusivity, in my opinion, must happen. There are templates of this being done elsewhere. The African society itself, this is how we have lived. You had kings, you had chiefs, there were elders, there were community and town hall meetings. Why do you think these meetings existed? Because they needed input from a lot of people who were active and contributing to the society. We have just superimposed this very dirigist, extractive political institution built by colonialism without any process of re-engineering that, and we call it democracy. So young people asking questions today, this is what we want to overthrow. The system that says you are only relevant when it's time to choose the leader, rather than making decisions about, okay, what kind of healthcare do I want? Do I want healthcare that is delivered to me at home? What kind of transportation system do I want? Do I want trams? Do I want trains? None of you has asked that question for some strange reason. Meanwhile, you have ideas on how these things have to work.
Right. And do we see, I mean, as we come to a close of this now, Patrick, do we see that there is a gradual breaking down of the system that then locks a lot of people out? Do we see that there would be a gradual breaking down, or do we see in our lifetimes that this could actually change for the kind of inclusive governance that we are then searching for?
That's almost asking me to, look into that glass.
Your crystal ball, which is behind you. Yeah.
a lot is changing, right? So the eternal optimist in me will suggest that a lot of change is happening, and I can give you a few country cases. I mean, in Ghana, for example, it was fashionable, 12, 16 years ago, for politicians to say anything anyhow during elections and get away with it, and they get elected and they don't deliver. In the last 16 years, there's been a consistent advocacy by young people demanding credibility of policy decisions and commitments that governments, political parties make before they get elected. Today, it is a topical conversation in the country, even as we get to elections. I've seen that happen in places like Nigeria. I've seen that happen in places like Zimbabwe. I've seen it happen in Sierra Leone and Senegal as well. So you have a shift gradually where people are beginning to wake up to realize that actually there's a cooler way of doing this that brings young people and brings different, marginalized people into the conversation. There is. Is it happening at the pace we wanted to because of the existential threats that confront the African continent today? I'm afraid not. Because, by 2050, we're told by some estimates that we probably have the largest population on the globe, and a greater percentage of our population is going to be very youthful. What it means is that decisions that are being made today must be very sensitive to that. I'm afraid I don't seem to see that, because all the organs of decision making from Pan-African level to regional level to to levels of the state is really not attuned with that existential threat. That if we don't make these changes quickly and fast enough, you have a lot of young people that are going to be caught behind the eight ball. And when that happens, who knows what that implosion is going to look like? Almost suggesting that we will not benefit from this very youthful budget we have, what they call economists have labeled the demographic dividend that Africa has. We will not be able to benefit extensively out of that. All right? So it is happening. We must collectively, and that's where this conversation goes back to that point.
Sure.
When we have conversations like this, young people in Kenya wake up and realize that, wait a minute, this thing is actually possible. I can find innovative ways of actually participating, and gradually maybe we'll speed up that process. I think that's the only way to go.
For sure.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That's Patrick Kwabena. He is a political commentator, writes for the Africa Report, and also does a lot of advocacy work. Today we are also branding him the youth advocate.
For Africa.
For Africa. Thank you very much for speaking to us, and also for waking up that early to speak to us from Accra, Ghana. What time is it now? Is it...
it's just getting to about 6 a.m.
Right.
So pretty early here.
Yeah.
Pretty early.
Thank you.
For
Thanks
speaking
for
to
that,
us.
Patrick.